In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a scream shatters the silence of the local library, where a mysterious woman lies dead, clutching a cryptic note. The truth lies in the margins. Who was she, and what secret was worth killing for? Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, as she unravels a chilling web of blackmail, forgery, and hidden legacies. From a secret room in the library to a trail of ink-stained clues, each step pulls her deeper into a conspiracy that threatens to unravel the village. Will she expose the killer before another body falls, or will the truth stay buried forever? Dive into Miss Marple and the Library Corpse Conundrum, a tale of suspense where every shadow hides a secret and every clue raises a question. Chapter 1. The body in the stacks. The autumn afternoon in St. Mary Mead draped itself in a soft golden haze, the kind that made the village seem suspended in a timeless dream. Leaves, brittle and amber, skittered across the cobblestone path leading to the St. Mary Mead Public Library, a squat, ivy-clad building that stood like a sentinel of knowledge at the edge of the village green. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged paper and polished wood, a sanctuary for the curious and the contemplative. Miss Jane Marple, her basket swinging lightly on her arm, stepped through the heavy oak door, her eyes bright with anticipation. She had come in search of a rare edition of Pride and Prejudice, rumoured to be tucked away in the library's modest collection, but fate, as it so often did in her quiet life, had other plans. Clara Wren, the young librarian, stood behind the counter, her auburn hair pinned haphazardly, her spectacles slipping down her nose. She was sorting a stack of returned books with a distracted air, her fingers trembling slightly as she stamped a due date with more force than necessary. The library was nearly empty, save for old Mr. Pym dozing in an armchair by the window, his snores a soft counterpoint to the ticking of the grandfather clock. Clara glanced up as Miss Marple entered, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good afternoon, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but carrying that unmistakable note of curiosity. "I trust you've had a quiet day." Clara's hand froze mid-stamp, and for a moment her gaze darted toward the towering shelves at the back of the room. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice a touch too high. "Quiet, yes, very quiet, just dusting and sorting, you know." She pushed her spectacles up, leaving a smudge of ink on her cheek. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. She had known Clara since the girl was a child, always eager to please, always a little nervous under scrutiny. There was something amiss today, the jitteriness that went beyond Clara's usual shyness. Miss Marple set her basket on the counter and adjusted her gloves. "I've come about that Austen first edition you mentioned last week. Is it still in the reserve section?" Clara nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, it's in the back. I'll fetch it for you." She hesitated, then added, "It's in historical fiction, I think, near the far shelves." Her eyes flickered again toward the stacks, and Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the way Clara's fingers clutched the edge of the counter. "Very well," Miss Marple said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "I'll browse a bit while you look, no hurry." She moved toward the shelves, her steps measured, her senses alert. The library was a labyrinth of tall bookcases, their shadows stretching long in the fading light. The historical fiction section was tucked in a dim corner, where the air felt cooler, heavier, as if the weight of countless stories pressed against the walls. As Miss Marple rounded a corner, her foot brushed something soft yet unyielding. She paused, her heart giving a small, curious thud. Bending down, she peered into the narrow aisle between two bookcases. There, slumped against the shelves, was a figure-woman, her body unnaturally still, a velvet cloak, deep green and shimmering, faintly draped over her like a shroud, her head lolled to one side, her face pale, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A thin trickle of blood had dried at the corner of her mouth, and in her right hand she clutched a crumpled piece of paper. Miss Marple straightened, her breath steady despite the shock. She had seen death before, too often, perhaps, but it never failed to stir a quiet resolve within her. She glanced back toward the counter, where Clara was still rummaging through a drawer. Oblivious, or perhaps pretending to be, Miss Marple knelt carefully, her knees creaking, and examined the scene, without touching anything. The woman's attire was elegant, but out of place for St. Mary Mead. Her cloak was too fine, her boots too polished for the muddy lanes of the village. A faint scent of lavender clung to her, mingling with the musty odour of old books. The paper in the woman's hand caught Miss Marple's eye. She leaned closer, careful not to disturb the scene, and made out a few words scrawled in a hurried hand. The truth lies in the margins. The phrase was cryptic, yet it sent a shiver through her, stirring a memory she couldn't quite place. She stood, her mind already turning over possibilities. The body had not been here long, the blood was still tacky, the skin cool but not cold, and the position, slumped so neatly against the shelves, suggested the body had been moved after death. A staged scene, perhaps. "Clara," Miss Marple called softly, her voice carrying just enough urgency to summon the librarian without alarming Mr. Pym, who still snored blissfully. Clara appeared at the end of the aisle, her face paling as she saw the body. A small gasp escaped her, and she clutched the edge of a bookcase for support. "Oh, heavens," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Is she?" "I'm afraid so," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but firm. "We mustn't touch anything, Clara, not yet. Do you know her?" Clara shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, I don't think so. She's not from the village." "Is she? I'd have noticed someone like that." Her words tumbled out, too fast, too eager. Miss Marple noted the way Clara's hands twisted together, the way her gaze darted to the paper in the dead woman's hand. "Perhaps, Miss Marple," said, her voice soothing, "but we must call Inspector Craddock at once. And Clara, dear, it's best if we keep this quiet for now. No need to upset the village until we know more." She paused, her eyes meeting Clara's. "You'll lock the library after I leave, won't you? And stay here until the police arrive?" Clara nodded, her face a mask of anxiety. "Yes, Miss Marple, I'll do that." She hesitated, then added, "You don't think it wasn't an accident, was it?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unyielding. "I'm afraid, my dear, that accidents don't leave notes in their victims' hands. Now, let's be practical. I'll fetch the inspector, and you'll keep an eye on things here." As Miss Marple stepped out into the crisp evening air, her mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of what she had seen. The velvet cloak, the lavender scent, the cryptic note all pointed to a story far deeper than a simple village tragedy. The woman had been placed there deliberately, her body arranged like a prop in a play, and Clara's nervousness, her quick glances toward the shelves, suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Miss Marple tightened her scarf and set off toward the police station, her steps brisk despite the gathering dusk. St. Mary Mead might be a quiet village, but its secrets, she knew, were anything but. The library, now locked behind her, stood silent, its windows glowing faintly in the twilight. Inside, Clara stood alone, her breath shallow, her eyes fixed on the aisle where the body lay. She had promised to keep quiet, but her heart raced with a secret she wasn't ready to share, not with Miss Marple, not with anyone. The note in the dead woman's hand was no mystery to her. She had seen it before, slipped into a book, returned just yesterday. And the words, "The truth lies in the margins," were a warning meant for someone else, someone Clara feared was still watching. Miss Marple's cottage was a haven of warmth when she returned later that evening after speaking with Inspector Craddock. The inspector, a practical man with a grudging respect for Miss Marple's instincts, had promised to secure the scene and begin inquiries discreetly. He had noted the same details Miss Marple had: the moved body, the note, the lavender scent, but he lacked her knack for seeing the human threads that wove such clues together. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting needles clicking. Softly, as she thought, the dead woman was no villager, that much was certain. Her clothes spoke of money, her boots of travel. The note suggested purpose, perhaps a mission, and Clara's behavior, her trembling hands, her evasive eyes pointed to a connection, however reluctant. Miss Marple's mind drifted to a scandal in St. Mary Mead, one involving a forged will and a missing book. The phrase "the truth lies in the margins" echoed something she had heard then, though the details eluded her, like a tune half remembered. She set her knitting aside and opened her notebook, jotting down the day's observations. The library, she wrote, was more than a repository of books. It was a stage, and someone had set a scene there, expecting it to be found. The question was why and by whom. Clara's role, she suspected, was not that of a bystander. The girl's fear was genuine, but so was her secrecy. And the library itself, with its creaking shelves and hidden corners, held answers Miss Marple was determined to uncover. As the clock struck 9, Miss Marple rose to make a cup of tea, her thoughts circling back to the body in the stacks. Tomorrow she would return to the library, ostensibly to collect her Austen, but really to watch, to listen, to piece together the puzzle. The dead woman had come to St. Mary Mead for a reason, and Miss Marple would not rest until she knew what it was. For now, though the village slept, unaware of the darkness that had settled in its heart. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, sipped her tea, her mind as sharp as the autumn air outside. Chapter 2. Whispers in the village the morning after the grim discovery in the library. St. Mary Mead buzzed with an undercurrent of unease, like a hive stirred by an unseen hand. The news of the corpse had slipped out, despite Clara Wren's promise to keep silent, and now it wove through the village like a restless breeze. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, made her way to the vicarage, her basket swinging lightly with a few skeins of wool as a pretext for her visit. The vicarage, a rambling stone house with roses climbing its walls, was the heart of village gossip, and Miss Marple knew it would be the perfect place to gauge the pulse of St. Mary Mead's reaction. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and lavender, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clements, was bustling about with a tray of tea and scones. Her round face was flushed, her eyes bright with the thrill of scandal. "Miss Marple, you've heard, haven't you?" she said, setting the tray down with a clatter. "A body in the library. It's dreadful, simply dreadful, and no one knows who she was." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her expression one of polite concern. "Indeed, Mrs. Clements, it's most unsettling." I was at the library myself yesterday when poor Clara found her. A terrible shock for the girl." She paused, her eyes flicking to the vicar, who stood by the fireplace, polishing his spectacles with a handkerchief. "What do the villagers make of it, Reverend?" Reverend Clemens looked up, his thin face creasing with discomfort. "Oh well, you know how people talk. Some say she was a runaway heiress, others a spy. Ridiculous notions, of course." He cleared his throat, his fingers fumbling with the spectacles. "But no one seems to know her name. A stranger, they say." Miss Marple's needles clicked. Softly, as she pulled a ball of wool from her basket, her hands moving with the ease of long habit. "A stranger, yes," she murmured, "but strangers don't often find their way to St. Mary Mead without purpose. And that note in her hand most curious." Mrs. Clements leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A note? Oh, do tell, Miss Marple. What did it say?" Miss Marple's lips curved slightly, though her eyes remained sharp. "Something about truth and margins, I believe. Rather cryptic, don't you think?" She watched Mrs. Clements' face, noting the flicker of excitement, and then turned her gaze to the vicar, who had gone still, his spectacles forgotten in his hand. "Margins," he repeated, almost to himself. Odd choice of words. He busied himself with the fire, poking at the logs with unnecessary vigor. Miss Marple filed away his reaction, her mind turning over a memory from years past, a scandal involving a disputed manuscript, whispers of forgery, and a phrase not unlike the one on the note. The details were hazy, but they tugged at her, insistent as a loose thread. The conversation shifted to village matters, but Miss Marple listened with only half an ear, her thoughts on the dead woman, the velvet cloak, the polished boots, the lavender centaur suggested a life of refinement, yet one touched by secrecy, and the note, "The truth lies in the margins," hinted at a hidden knowledge, perhaps tied to the library itself. She excused herself after a second cup of tea, promising to return for the vicarage's autumn fete, and stepped out into the crisp morning. The village green was alive with activity. Mrs. Potts from the Blue Boar in sweeping her doorstep, Mr. Pym arguing with the postman about a late delivery, and a cluster of women near the bakery exchanging hushed words. Miss Marple caught fragments of their conversation as she passed. They say she was a private investigator, poking into old secrets. Dangerous business, that. The words sent a prickle down her spine, not for their content, but for their speed. Clara had promised silence, yet the village was already alight with rumors. Someone had talked. Miss Marple. Steps led her back to the library, its doors still locked, a police constable stationed outside. Inspector Craddock had left a note at her cottage, promising to meet her later, but she had no intention of waiting idly. She circled the building, her eyes scanning the ivy-covered walls for anything amiss. A narrow window at the back, partially obscured by a climbing rose, caught her attention. The latch was loose, the frame slightly ajar, as if someone had pried it open and failed to secure it properly. She made a mental note to mention it to Craddock, though she suspected he'd overlook its significance. Inside, Clara was nowhere to be seen. But the library's heavy silence greeted Miss Marple as the constable let her in under strict instructions to touch nothing. The historical fiction section was cordoned off, the body removed, but the air still held a chill. Miss Marple's gaze fell on the shelf where the body had lain. A gap caught her eye, missing book, its absence marked by a thin layer of dust, disturbed on either side. She crouched, careful not to cross the police tape, and noted the titles nearby. The Scarlet Pimpernel, Ivanhoe, A Tale of Two Cities. Popular novels, but nothing rare or remarkable. Yet the missing book nagged at her, a piece of the puzzle just out of reach as she straightened. A faint creak came from the back of the library near the storage room. Miss Marple moved silently, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The storage room door was ajar, and inside she glimpsed a stack of old ledgers, their leather covers cracked with age. One lay open on a table, its pages filled with neat columns of names and dates. Miss Marple's heart quickened. She slipped on her gloves purely for warmth. She would later assure Craddock hand leafed through the ledger, her eyes scanning the entries. They were records of library loans, but some names were circled in red ink, accompanied by cryptic abbreviations: scribe, keeper, shadow. The dates stretched back years, some as recent as last week. A noise behind her made her turn, and Clara stood in the doorway, her face pale as moonlight. "Miss Marple, I didn't know you were here." Her hands twisted together, and her eyes darted to the ledger. "I was just tidying up." Miss Marple closed the ledger gently, her smile disarming. "Of course, dear. I was just looking for that Austen again. Silly of me to wander back here." She paused, her gaze steady. "These old records are fascinating, aren't they? So many names, so many stories." Clara swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "They're just old loans. Nothing important." But her hands betrayed her, trembling as she reached for the ledger, tucking it under her arm. Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, and made her way back to the main room. "Well, I shan't keep you, Clara. I'm sure you have plenty to do with the police about." She paused at the door, turning back. "Oh, and Clara, do be careful with that window at the back. It's a bit loose, someone might think it an invitation." Clara's eyes widened, but she only nodded, clutching the ledger tighter. Miss Marple stepped outside, the constable tipping his hat as she passed. The village was settling into its midday rhythm, but the whispers followed her, a chorus of speculation and fear. She thought of the ledger's circled names, the missing book, the loose window. Someone had wanted the body found, she was certain, and someone else was desperate to keep secrets buried. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched as she stared out at the garden. The dead woman, she suspected, had been no ordinary visitor. A private investigator the villagers said, perhaps sniffing out a truth hidden in those ledgers, or in the missing book. And Clara, poor nervous Clara, was caught in the middle, her fear as telling as her silence. Miss Marple jotted a few notes in her book, circling the word scribe. It was a clue, she felt sure, to the heart of the conundrum. Tomorrow she would dig deeper, starting with the library's backroom and its secrets. For now, though, she sipped her tea, her mind weaving the threads of St. Mary Mead's latest mystery into a pattern only she could see. Chapter 3. The Librarian's Secret. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village as Miss Jane Marple made her way back to the library. Her steps were brisk, her mind sharper than the chill in the air. The events of the previous day, the body in the stacks, the cryptic note, the whispered rumours had settled into her thoughts like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, each one demanding its place. The ledger she had glimpsed in the libraries, backroom with its circled names and cryptic abbreviations, was a thread she could not ignore. Nor could she overlook Clara Wren's trembling hands and evasive eyes. There was a story behind the young librarian's fear, and Miss Marple intended to uncover it. The library was open again. though the historical fiction section remained cordoned off with police tape, a stark reminder of the tragedy. Clara stood behind the counter, her auburn hair pulled back tightly, her spectacles perched precariously on her nose. She was sorting a stack of children's books, her movements mechanical, as if her mind were elsewhere. The library was quiet, save for the soft rustle of pages from a lone patrona, young mother browsing picture books with her toddler. Miss Marple approached the counter, her basket tucked under her arm, her smile as warm as ever. "Good morning, Clara," she said, her voice carrying a gentle curiosity. "I hope you've managed some rest after yesterday's ordeal." Clara's hands faltered, a book slipping from her grasp. She caught it quickly, her cheeks flushing. "Oh, Miss Marple. Yes, I suppose. It's been a bit much, hasn't it?" Her eyes darted toward the back of the library, where the storage room door stood slightly ajar. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, setting her basket on the counter. "Quite so, dear. Such a shock for us all. I was wondering, though, did you ever find the Austen I was after? Or perhaps you've been too busy with other matters." Her tone was light, but her eyes held Clara's, steady and searching. Clara adjusted her spectacles, her fingers trembling slightly. "The Austen, yes, it's still in the reserve section. I can get it for you now." She hesitated, then added, "I've just been sorting things, you know. Keeping busy." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile unwavering. "Keeping busy is the best remedy for nerves. Though I imagine it's hard, with the police coming and going. Have they learned anything more about the poor woman?" Clara's lips parted, then closed again. She busied herself with a stack of index cards, her voice low. "Not that they've told me. Just a stranger, they think. No one from the village." Her words were clipped, as if she were reciting a rehearsed line. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but deliberate. "A stranger, yes. But I heard a whisper at the vicarage that she might have been a private investigator. Evelyn Marsh, I believe her name, was dead. She ever visit the library before, Clara? Perhaps asking about something specific?" The colour drained from Clara's face, and for a moment she seemed to shrink behind the counter. "Evelyn Marsh," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, she might have come in a few weeks ago. Asked about some old manuscripts, I think. I didn't pay much mind." She fumbled with the cards, dropping several to the floor. Miss Marple bent to help gather them, her movements slow and deliberate. As she handed the cards back, her fingers brushed a small notebook tucked beneath the counter, a personal one, not part of the library's records. Its cover was worn, its pages dog-eared. Clara snatched it up, tucking it into her apron pocket with a nervous laugh. "Just my notes," Clara said quickly. "Nothing important." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained. "Kindly, we all have our little secrets, don't we? I keep a notebook myself, helps me remember the little things." She paused, then added, "Like the books Evelyn Marsh borrowed. Could you check the records for me, dear? It might help the inspector." Clara hesitated, then nodded, moving to the card catalogue with a stiffness that betrayed her reluctance. Miss Marple followed, her gaze wandering to the shelves where the body had been found. The gap where the missing book had been was still there, the dust undisturbed except for a faint smudge, as if someone had brushed against it recently. She filed the observation away, her mind turning to the ledger and its cryptic entries. As Clara flipped through the catalogue, Miss Marple said casually, I couldn't help noticing that ledger in the back room yesterday. So many names, so many stories. I suppose the library keeps records of all sorts of things, meetings perhaps, or special collections. Clara's hand froze, her knuckles whitening on the catalogue drawer. Meetings, she said, her voice high. Oh, just the usual book clubs and such. Nothing out of the ordinary. She pulled a card from the drawer, her movements jerky. Here it is. Evelyn Marsh borrowed 2 books last month, The Moonstone and The Woman in White. She returned them, though nothing unusual. Miss Marple took the card, her eyes scanning the titles. Both were Wilkie Collins novels, tales of deception and hidden truths. She noted the dates: borrowed 3 weeks ago, returned just days before the murder. How interesting, she murmured. Did she ask about anything else? Manuscripts, perhaps, like you mentioned. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. She did ask about some old papers in the archive, things we don't lend out. I told her they were restricted. Her voice wavered, and she glanced toward the storage room again, as if expecting someone to emerge. Before Miss Marple could press further, the library door swung open, admitting Mr. Hawthorne, the library's trustee. His presence filled the room like a storm cloud, his broad shoulders and stern jaw cutting an imposing figure. His suit was immaculate, but his eyes were sharp with irritation. Clara, what's this nonsense about keeping the library open? He barked, ignoring Miss Marple. The police are still poking about, and we don't need more gossip. Clara shrank back, her hands clutching the counter. I thought it best to keep things normal, Mr. Hawthorne. The inspector said we could open as long as normal. Hawthorne cut her off, his voice dripping with disdain. A woman was murdered here, girl. There's nothing normal about it. He turned to Miss Marple, his expression softening slightly, though his eyes remained cold. Miss Marple, I'm surprised to see you here. Surely you've better things to do than meddle in this mess. Miss Marple's smile was serene, unshaken. Oh, Mr. Hawthorne, I only came for a book. But I must say, it's a pity about poor Miss Marsh. I understand she was asking about manuscripts. Did she ever approach you about the library's collection? Hawthorne's jaw tightened, and for a moment his hand lingered on the silver watch chain at his waist. Manuscripts. Nonsense. She was a nosy sort, always snooping where she wasn't wanted. I told her to leave well enough alone. He turned to Clara, his tone sharp. See that the police get what they need, and no more. We don't need the village stirred up further. As he stormed out, Miss Marple watched him go, noting the stiffness in his gait, the way his hand clenched as he passed the historical fiction section. She turned back to Clara, who was staring at the counter, her face pale. Mr. Hawthorne seems quite upset, Miss Marple said gently. I suppose he's worried about the library's reputation. Clara nodded, her voice barely audible. He doesn't like trouble, says it scares off donors. She hesitated, then added, Miss Marple, you won't tell anyone about the ledger, will you? It's just old records, like I said. Of course, dear Miss Marple said, patting Clara's hand. Mum's the word. But her mind was racing. Hawthorne's reaction to Evelyn Marsh's name, Clara's secrecy about the ledger, the missing book, call were threads in a tapestry. She was beginning to see. She thanked Clara for the card and promised to return later, her steps light as she left the library. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing a village bustling with its usual rhythm, yet beneath it, the whispers persisted. Miss Marple paused by the green, her eyes catching a shadow moving behind the library's hedge, too quick to identify. Someone was watching, she was certain, and the ledger held the key. As she walked home, her thoughts turned to Evelyn Marsh's borrowed books, The Moonstone and The Woman in White, both stories of secrets buried in plain sight. Perhaps Evelyn had been searching for something similar, hidden in the library's archives. And Clara, with her nervous glances and hidden notebook, knew more than she was letting on. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched as she opened her notebook. She jotted down the titles of Evelyn's books, the ledger's abbreviations, and Hawthorne's sharp words. The library, she realized, was not just a crime scene but a vault of secrets, and Clara was its reluctant keeper. Tomorrow she would return to the library, perhaps to borrow those Collins novels herself. For now she sipped her tea, her mind weaving the day's clues into a pattern that was growing clearer with every thread. Chapter 4. A trail of ink. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, gilding the rooftops with a deceptive warmth that did little to ease the chill in Miss Jane Marple's bones. She sat at her small writing desk, the ledgers, cryptic entries scribe, keep her shadow, etched in her mind like a riddle waiting to be solved. The memory of Clara Wren's pale face and Mr. Hawthorne's sharp dismissal lingered, each a piece of the puzzle that was Evelyn Marsh's murder. The library, Miss Marple was certain, held more than books. It guarded secrets, and the ledger was a map to them. With her shawl draped over her shoulders, she set out to visit Dr. Percival Gray, the local historian whose name, she suspected, might be tied to the mysterious scribe. Dr. Gray lived in a narrow, ivy-draped cottage at the edge of the village, its windows glowing with the soft light of oil lamps. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke as Miss Marple knocked, her basket tucked under her arm, a jar of homemade marmalade as her pretext. The door creaked open, revealing Dr. Gray, a wiry man with a shock of white hair and eyes that darted like a cornered fox. His tweed jacket was patched at the elbows, and his hands were stained with ink, as if he'd been writing for hours. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice thin but polite. "What a surprise. Do come in." He stepped aside, gesturing to a cluttered parlour filled with books, maps, and stacks of yellowed papers. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming as she set the marmalade on a table. "I was passing by and thought you might enjoy a taste of my preserves, and, well, I couldn't help thinking of you after the dreadful business at the library. You're so knowledgeable about its history." Dr. Gray's smile was tight, his fingers fidgeting with a pen on his desk. "Kind of you, Miss Marple. Yes, dreadful business, indeed. Poor Miss Marsh. I barely knew her, of course." He busied himself with a teapot, his movements jerky. "Just a passing acquaintance, you might say." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her eyes roaming the room. A stack of manuscripts sat precariously on a shelf, their edges curling with age. A bottle of ink, its cap loose, stood on the desk, a small pool of black spreading across a blotter. The scent of it was sharp, familiar. She had noticed a similar stain near Evelyn's body, a smudge on the shelf where the missing book had been. "You must spend hours with your research," she said, her voice light. "I suppose you've come across all sorts of curious documents in the library's archives." Dr. Gray poured tea, his hand trembling slightly, sending a splash onto the saucer. "Oh yes, the archives are a treasure trove. Old deeds, letters, the odd manuscript. Nothing too exciting, mind you." He laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes, just dusty relics of village life. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her gaze steady. And yet Evelyn Marsh seemed quite interested in those relics. Clara mentioned she was asking about manuscripts. I wonder if she found something significant. Dr. Gray's cup rattled against its saucer. Did she? Well, she was a curious sort, always poking about. I told her the archives were restricted, but she was persistent. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Not that there's anything worth finding. Just old family records, you know. Nothing to do with her death. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was racing. The ledger's scribe could well be Dr. Gray, with his ink-stained hands and nervous demeanour. She thought of the note in Evelyn's hand, "The truth lies in the margins," and wondered if it referred to a literal margin. Perhaps a note scribbled in one of those manuscripts. "You must have known her better than most," she said gently. "I heard she attended some of your literary discussions." Dr. Gray's eyes widened, and he set his cup down with a clink. "Literary discussions? Oh, just a small group. We met to talk about books, Dickens, Brontë, that sort of thing. Nothing serious." He stood abruptly, moving to his desk as if to shield it. "I'm afraid I have some work to finish, Miss Marple. Thank you for the marmalade," as he turned. A folded paper slipped from his jacket pocket, fluttering to the floor. Miss Marple's eyes followed it, noting its torn edge and faded script. She rose, her movements slow, and picked it up before he could. "Oh dear, you've dropped something," she said, holding it out, but not before glimpsing a few words. "Provenance disputed. A page from one of your manuscripts, perhaps." Dr. Gray snatched it back, his face flushing. "Yes, just notes. Nothing important." He stuffed it into his pocket, his hands shaking. "Really, Miss Marple, I must get on." "Of course," she said, her smile serene. "I shan't keep you." She stepped outside, the door closing sharply behind her. The evening air was cool, the village quiet save for the distant bark of a dog. As she walked home, the torn page lingered in her mind. It was no ordinary note matched the heavy paper of the library's archives, and those words, "provenance disputed," hinted at a document valuable enough to kill for. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched as she opened her notebook. She jotted down the day's observations: Dr. Gray's ink-stained hands, the spilled bottle, the torn page. The ink was a clue, she was certain, linking him to the crime scene, and his nervous denial of Evelyn's interest in the manuscripts only deepened her suspicion. The ledger's scribe was almost certainly Dr. Gray, but what had he been hiding? A forged document, perhaps, or a secret buried in the library's archives. She thought of Clara's fear, Mr. Hawthorne's anger, and the missing book. The library was a nexus of secrets, and Evelyn Marsh had stumbled into its heart. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she recalled the literary discussions Dr. Gray had mentioned. Were they truly about Dickens, or something more clandestine? The ledger suggested meetings, perhaps a group guarding a shared secret. And that torn page, had it come from the missing book, or something else entirely? As the clock struck 7, Miss Marple rose to make tea, her mind weaving the threads of the mystery. Tomorrow she would return to the library, perhaps to examine those manuscripts Clara had mentioned. For now, she sat with her notebook, circling the word provenance. The truth, she suspected, lay not just in the margins, but in the hands that had written there. And Dr. Gray, with his trembling fingers and ink-stained secrets, was a man worth watching. Chapter 5. The hidden room. The dusk settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet curtain, softening the village's edges and lending an air of secrecy to its quiet lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the evening chill, walked purposefully toward the library. Accompanied by Clara Wren, the young librarian had agreed to meet her after hours, ostensibly to help locate the elusive Austen First Edition, but Miss Marple's true aim was to explore the storage room and its secrets. The ledger's cryptic entries, Dr. Gray's nervous denial, and the torn page with its hint of disputed provenance had sharpened her curiosity. The library, she was certain, held more than books. It concealed a truth that had cost Evelyn Marsh her life. Clara fumbled with the keys as they approached the library's side entrance, her hands trembling in the dim light of a single street lamp. "I don't usually come here so late," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustle of leaves. "It feels different at night." Miss Marple's smile was reassuring, though her eyes were alert, scanning the shadows. "Nonsense, Clara, it's just the same old library, only quieter. Perfect for a bit of sleuthing, don't you think?" Her tone was light, but she noted the way Clara's gaze darted to the hedge where Miss Marple had glimpsed a shadow the day before. The loose window she had noticed then was now tightly shut, but a faint scratch on the sill suggested recent tampering. Inside. The library was a cavern of silence, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and wax polish. Clara lit a small lantern, its glow casting flickering patterns across the shelves. The historical fiction section, still cordoned off, loomed in the corner like a silent witness. Miss Marple led the way to the storage room, her steps soft but deliberate. "Let's start with those manuscripts Evelyn was so interested in," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm sure they're in here somewhere." Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening on the lantern. "The manuscripts, they're just old papers, Miss Marple. Nothing special." But her eyes betrayed her. Flicking toward a heavy oak bookcase at the far end of the room, Miss Marple followed her gaze, noting the bookcase's odd placement, stood slightly askew, as if not quite flush with the wall. "That's an interesting piece," she said, moving closer. "Looks almost as if it could move." She ran her fingers along its edge, feeling for a catch or hinge. Clara's breath hitched, but she said nothing, her lantern trembling in her hand. With a gentle push, Miss Marple felt the bookcase give way, swinging inward with a low groan to reveal a narrow doorway. Clara gasped, her face spelling. I didn't know that was there," she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained kindly. "How curious," she said, stepping into the hidden room. The space was small, no larger than a pantry, its walls lined with shelves holding boxes of letters, photographs, and leather-bound journals. A single table stood in the center, its surface littered with papers and a dusty candelabrum. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and secrets. Clara hovered at the threshold, her lantern casting long shadows. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. It's not safe." "Nonsense, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice steady as she examined the shelves. "It's just a room, and rooms hold stories. Let's see what this one has to tell us." She lifted a box, its lid marked with a faded cresta, lion rampant, the same as the one on Dr. Gray's letterhead. Inside were photographs, brittle and yellowed, showing groups of villagers from decades past. One caught her eye, a young Evelyn Marsh, her face serious, standing beside a younger Dr. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, their expressions tense. The photograph was dated 1905, far too old for the Evelyn who had died, suggesting a family connection, perhaps a mother or aunt. "Clara, look at this," Miss Marple said, holding up the photograph. "Did Evelyn ever mention family in St. Mary Mead?" Clara shook her head, her eyes wide. No, she'd never said anything like that, just asked about manuscripts. Her voice trembled, and she stepped back, as if the photograph burned her. Miss Marple set it down, her mind racing. The ledger's scribe and keeper could be Dr. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, tied to Evelyn through some long-buried scandal. She turned to a stack of letters, their wax seals cracked but intact. One, addressed to the scribe, was written. In a flowing script, its contents a warning. The legacy must remain buried, lest the village pay the price. The letter was unsigned, but its paper matched the torn page from Dr. Gray's pocket before Miss Marple could read further. A sharp creak echoed from the main library, followed by the faint scuff of footsteps. Clara froze, her lantern flickering, as her hand shook. "Someone's here," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Miss Marple pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes sharp. "Stay calm, dear," she murmured, extinguishing the lantern with a quick pinch. The room plunged into darkness, broken only by slivers of moonlight filtering through a high vent. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate, pausing outside the storage room. Miss Marple guided Clara behind a shelf, her hand steady on the girl's arm. The bookcase creaked, as if someone tested its weight, then fell silent. After a tense moment, the footsteps retreated, fading into the night. Clara's breath came, in shallow gasps. "Who was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Miss Marple said, relighting the lantern. "But someone is very interested in what we're doing." She tucked the letter into her basket, her movements swift but calm. "We'd best leave, Clara. This room has told us enough for now." They slipped out of the hidden room, pushing the bookcase back into place. Clara's face was ashen, her hands clutching the lantern as if it were a lifeline. Miss Marple led her to the side entrance, locking the door behind them. The village was silent, the street lamp casting a lonely glow. "Go home, Clara," Miss Marple said gently, "and don't speak of this to anyone. Not yet." Clara nodded, her eyes darting to the shadows. "I won't, Miss Marple, I promise." But her voice held a note of fear that told Miss Marple she was hiding something still. As Miss Marple walked home, the letter in her basket felt heavy, its words echoing in her mind. The photograph tied Evelyn to Dr. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne, suggesting a shared history, perhaps a scandal that had resurfaced. The hidden room was a vault of secrets, and someone, perhaps the intruder wanted them, kept locked away. She thought of the ledgers, abbreviations, the inkstains, the missing book. The library was a labyrinth, and Evelyn had ventured to deep dot at her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the letter spread before her. She added its details to her notebook, circling the lion crest and the word legacy. The hidden room had confirmed her suspicions. Evelyn's death was no random act, but a desperate bid to silence her. Clara's fear, Dr. Gray's nerves, and Mr. Hawthorne's anger were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and the letter to the scribe was a key. Tomorrow she would confront Clara again, gently but firmly, to coax out the truth. For now, she sipped her tea, her mind tracing the contours of a mystery that grew darker with every step. Chapter 6. The Vicar's Alabetha. Morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a fragile light that did little to dispel the unease lingering in the village. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, the letter from the hidden room tucked safely in her desk drawer, its warning the legacy must remain buried going in her thoughts. The photograph of Evelyn Marsh with Dr. Gray and Mr. Hawthorne had stirred memories of old village scandals, but it was the ledger's cryptic entries, particularly the circled namekeeper, that drew her attention now. Reverend Clements. The vicar had been evasive at the vicarage, his reaction to the mention of the note in Evelyn's hand to pronounce to ignore. Today, Miss Marple resolved to visit him, her basket armed with a fresh batch of scones as her excuse. The vicar's garden was a riot of late summer roses, their scent mingling with the damp earth. As Miss Marple knocked on the door, Mrs. Clements answered, her apron dusted with flour, her face lighting up at the sight of the scones. "Miss Marple, how kind of you," she exclaimed, ushering her. Inside, the vicar's in his study, wrestling with Sunday's sermon. He's been ever so distracted since. Well, you know. Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle but her eyes sharp. "I can imagine, Mrs. Clements. Such a shock for the village. I thought I'd pop by to see how you're both faring." She followed Mrs. Clements to the study, where Reverend Clements sat at a cluttered desk, his pen scratching across a page. His thin frame was hunched, his spectacles slipping down his nose, and a faint sheen of sweat glistened on his brow despite the cool morning. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with a strained smile. "What a pleasant surprise. Do sit down." He gestured to a chair, his hands fidgeting with a stack of papers. "I'm afraid I'm rather behind on my work." "No trouble at all," Miss Marple said, setting her basket on the floor. "Brought some scones to cheer you up. It must be trying, with all this talk about the library." She paused, her gaze steady. "I understand you knew Evelyn Marsh, perhaps from those literary meetings Dr. Gray mentioned." The vicar's hand froze, the pen leaving a blot of ink on his sermon. "Evelyn Marsh," he said, his voice a touch too high. "Oh yes, vaguely. She attended a few discussions, I believe. Nothing formal, just a group of us chatting about books." He adjusted his spectacles. Avoiding her eyes, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she pulled her knitting from her basket, her hands moving with practiced ease. "How interesting," she said. "I heard she was quite keen on old manuscripts. Did she ever mention anything specific at your meetings? Perhaps something about a legacy?" Reverend Clements coughed, his fingers tightening on the pen. "A legacy? No, nothing like that. Just literary matters. Dickens, mostly." He stood abruptly, moving to a bookshelf as if to escape her gaze. "I'm afraid I don't recall much about her. She was rather quiet." Mrs. Clements, hovering in the doorway, chimed in. "Quiet, indeed. I saw her once, slipping out of the library late at night. Looked like she was up to no good, if you ask me." She caught her husband's sharp glance and faltered. "Not that I was spying, mind you." Miss Marple's smile was serene, though her mind was racing. "Late at night, you say? How curious. Reverend, were you ever at the library after hours? For your meetings, perhaps?" The vicar's face reddened, and he busied himself with a book, its cover stamped with a faint library mark. "After hours? No, I was here, working on my sermons. I'm always here in the evenings." His voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to his wife, as if seeking confirmation. Mrs. Clements frowned, her hands twisting in her apron. "Well, not always, dear. There was that night last week Tuesday, was it, when you were out till nearly midnight. Said you were visiting old Mrs. Harrow, but she told me at the market she hadn't seen you in weeks. The vicar's pen slipped, rolling across the desk. Did I say Mrs. Harrow? I meant I was at the church, preparing for the fete. My memory, you know. He laughed, a brittle sound that hung in the air. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze soft but unyielding. Of course, Reverend. We all get muddled sometimes. She reached into her basket, pulling out a small book she'd borrowed from the library, a copy of The Moonstone, one of Evelyn's choices. I found this quite gripping, she said, opening it to a page where a passage was underlined in faint pencil. The secret lies in what is left unsaid. Evelyn seems to have marked it. Did she ever discuss such themes at your meetings? Reverend Clement stared at the book, his face paling. No, I don't recall. She wasn't one for sharing. He turned back to his desk, his hands shaking as he shuffled papers. Miss Marple noticed a library stamp on one, a distinctive crest, the same as on the letter from the hidden room. It was faint but unmistakable, used only by the vicar for special collections. She rose, smoothing her skirt. Well, I mustn't keep you from your sermon. Thank you for the chat, Reverend. Mrs. Clemens, do enjoy the scones. As she stepped into the hall, she paused, turning back. Oh, Reverend, one last thing. That stamp on your paper sits quite unique. Does it come from the library's archives? The vicar's hand froze mid-shuffle. The stamp, oh, just an old one I use for notes. Nothing special. But his voice was strained, and Mrs. Clement's puzzled frown suggested she knew nothing of it. Miss Marple left the vicarage, the morning air crisp against her cheeks. The vicar's shaky alibi, his wife's unwitting contradiction, and the library stamp tied him to the ledger and the hidden room. The underlined passage in the Moonstone echoed the note in Evelyn's hand, suggesting she had been chasing a secret one the vicar might have shared. His literary meetings, she suspected, were a cover for something more clandestine, perhaps linked to the keeper in the ledger as she walked home. The village seemed to watch her, its windows like eyes in the morning light. A boy on a bicycle nearly collided with her, muttering an apology as he sped off, a folded paper slipping from his pocket. Miss Marple picked it up, her heart quickening as she recognized the same heavy paper as the letter from the hidden room. It was blank, but its texture was a clue. Another thread in the tapestry at her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched as she added the day's findings to her notebook. The vicar's alibi was crumbling, his connection to the library's secrets undeniable. The stamp, the underlined book, the ledger's keeper, all pointed to a man caught in a web of his own making. Tomorrow she would return to the library, perhaps to borrow The Woman in White and see what other passages Evelyn had marked. For now she sipped her tea, her mind tracing the contours of a mystery that grew more tangled with every step, yet closer to unraveling. Chapter 7. Shadows at the inn. The late morning in St. Mary Mead carried a deceptive calm, the kind that masked secrets beneath its placid surface. Miss Jane Marple, her basket swinging lightly with a few apples as a pretext, made her way to the Blue Boar Inn, where Evelyn Marsh had stayed before her untimely death. The inn, a timber-bird building with sagging eaves and a creaking sign, stood at the village's edge, its windows winking in the pale sunlight. The vicar's shaky alibi and the library stamp on his papers had deepened Miss Marple's suspicions, but she needed more, something tangible to connect the dots between the ledger, the hidden room, and Evelyn's purpose. The inn, she hoped, would offer a new thread in the tapestry of the mystery. Mrs. Potts. The innkeeper was polishing glasses behind the bar when Miss Marple entered, the air thick with the scent of ale and wood smoke. Her round face lit up at the sight of the apples. "Miss Marple, what a treat," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Come for a chat, have you? Or is it the gossip about that poor woman at the library?" Miss Marple's smile was warm, her eyes sharp as she set the apples on the counter. "A bit of both, Mrs. Potts. I heard Evelyn Marsh stayed here before. Well, before the tragedy. I thought you might know something about her." Mrs. Potts leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Oh, she was a queer one, that Miss Marsh kept to herself, mostly, but always scribbling in a little diary. Locked it with a tiny key, she did." She paused, glancing around the empty tap room. "Had a visitor one night, though. A man with a limp, came late and left quick. I didn't see his face, but he was no villager too furtive, if you ask me." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she pulled her knitting from her basket, her hands moving with practiced ease. A man with a limp. How intriguing did Evelyn seem. Anxious after his visit. Mrs. Potts nodded, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip. Anxious as a cat in a storm. Kept her door locked after that, and I heard her pacing half the night. Next day, she was off to the library again, asking me about old village families. Said she was tracing a history, but I reckon it was more than that. Miss Marple's mind turned over the new information. A man with a limp, a locked diary, a focus on village history, all pointed to Evelyn's investigation. Perhaps tied to the legacy mentioned in the Hidden Room's letter. Did she leave anything behind? She asked, her tone casual. Papers, perhaps, or that diary. Mrs. Potts hesitated, then beckoned Miss Marple toward a narrow staircase. "I shouldn't, but come with me. Her room's still as she left it. Police haven't got round to searching it yet." She led the way to a small, sparsely furnished room on the second floor, its window overlooking the village green. The bed was neatly made, but a faint scent of lavender lingered, matching the odour Miss Marple had noticed on Evelyn's body. On the nightstand lay a few items, a hairbrush, a vial of lavender oil, and a small brass key, half hidden beneath a handkerchief. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the key. Mrs. Potts nodded, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Miss Marple lifted the handkerchief, revealing the key's delicate design. It was small enough to fit a diary, she thought, recalling Mrs. Potts' description. She searched the room, her movements swift but careful, and found a locked diary tucked beneath the mattress. With a gentle twist, the key turned, and the diary opened to reveal Evelyn's neat handwriting. The entries were brief but telling. Met with the keeper refuses to speak of the legacy. The scribe is nervous, knows more than he admits. Must find the manuscript before it's too late. Miss Marple's breath caught. The diary confirmed her suspicions about the ledger's abbreviations, Reverend Clements as the keeper, Dr. Gray as the scribe. But the mention of a manuscript was new, likely the missing book from the library's shelves. She turned another page, finding a sketch of a lion crest, identical to the one in the hidden room. Beneath it, Evelyn had written, "The Stolen Legacy." In the margins, before she could read further, a shadow passed the window, fleeting but deliberate. Miss Marple glanced out, catching a glimpse of a figure limping across the green, his coat collar turned up against the wind. Mrs. Potts peering. Over her shoulder, gasped, "That's him, the man who visited her." Miss Marple closed the diary, slipping it into her basket with the key. "Thank you, Mrs. Potts," she said, her voice calm despite the pulse of excitement. "You've been most helpful. Best not mention this to anyone, not yet." She handed Mrs. Potts an apple, her smile disarming. "For your trouble." As they descended the stairs, the tap room was no longer empty. Mr. Hawthorne stood by the bar, his broad frame filling the space, his eyes narrowing as he saw Miss Marple. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff, "still sniffing about, are you? The police have this in hand." Miss Marple's smile didn't waver. "Just visiting an old friend, Mr. Hawthorne, though I'm surprised to see you here. I thought you preferred the library's quiet." She noted his slight limp as he shifted his weight, a detail she hadn't noticed before. It was subtle, perhaps from an old injury, but it matched Mrs. Potts' description. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "I go where I please, and I'd advise you to leave well enough alone. This business is no place for amateurs." He turned abruptly, his boots thudding on the floor as he left, his limp more pronounced in his haste. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind racing. The diary, the limping visitor, Hawthorne's presence, it all wove together, tightening the net around the library's secrets. She thanked Mrs. Potts again and stepped into the crisp air, the diary a heavy weight in her basket. The village. Green was quiet now, the limping figure gone, but the sense of being watched lingered. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the diary open before her. She added its entries to her notebook, circling manuscript and legacy. Hawthorne's limp placed him at the inn, perhaps as Evelyn's late-night visitor, and his hostility suggested he had something to hide. The diary's mention of a stolen legacy echoed the letter from the hidden room, pointing to a scandal that had drawn Evelyn to her death. Tomorrow she would confront Hawthorne, gently but firmly, to see what truths he might let slip. For now, she sipped her tea, her mind tracing the shadows that danced across St. Mary Mead, each one a clue to the conundrum that refused to stay buried. Chapter 8. The trustee's tale. The twilight over St. Mary Mead was a deep indigo, pierced by the first stars as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the library once more. The weight of Evelyn Marsh's diary in her basket felt like a silent accusation, its entries about the keeper, the scribe, and a stolen legacy pointing to a conspiracy rooted in the village's past. Mr. Hawthorne's limping figure at the Blue Boar Inn had stirred her suspicions, his curt dismissal betraying a fear that went beyond mere irritation. Tonight she intended to confront him, armed with the diary's revelations and her own quiet resolve. The library, she knew, was the heart of this mystery, and Hawthorne, as its trustee, held keys to its secrets, literal and otherwise. The library's windows glowed faintly, a single lamp burning inside where Hawthorne had agreed to meet her, ostensibly to discuss the library's funding. Clara Wren was absent, sent home early by Hawthorne's orders, which suited Miss Marple's purpose. She knocked softly, and the door creaked open, revealing Hawthorne's imposing frame in the doorway. His eyes narrowed, but he stepped aside, gesturing her in with a grudging nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and rough, "I hope this is quick. I've enough on my plate without your inquiries." Miss Marple's smile was serene, her basket tucked under her arm as she stepped into the dimly lit room. "Oh, I shan't take much of your time, Mr. Hawthorne. I only wanted to discuss the library's future and perhaps clear up a few things about poor Miss Marsh." She settled into a chair near the counter, her knitting needles clicking softly. as she pulled them from her basket. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and she noted the way Hawthorne's shoulders tensed at the mention of Evelyn's name. "The library's future is secure," he said, folding his arms. "As for Miss Marsh, I told you she was a nuisance, always prying into things that didn't concern her. The police will handle it." His limp was more pronounced as he paced, his boots scuffing the polished floor. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, her needles never pausing. "Prying, you say? I heard she was asking about a manuscript, something about a disputed legacy. Did she ever approach you about it?" She kept her tone light, but her gaze was sharp, catching the flicker of unease in his eyes. Hawthorne stopped, pacing, his hand resting on the counter, fingers brushing a heavy brass letter opener. A manuscript. Nonsense. She was chasing shadows, digging up old gossip. I told her to leave it alone. His voice was sharp, but there was a tremor beneath it, like a crack in a damn dot. Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile gentle. "Old gossip can be dangerous, can't it? I found a diary of hers at the inn, you see. She mentioned meeting someone, a man with a limp who seemed quite upset about her inquiries. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" The air in the library seemed to thicken, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the lamp. Hawthorne's face darkened, his hand tightening on the letter opener. "A diary," he said, his voice low. "You've been busy, haven't you? I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I'd be careful if I were you. Some things are best left buried." Before she could respond, the lamp flickered, then went out, plunging the library into darkness. A sudden gust rattled the windows, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her voice remained calm. "Oh dear, a power cut. How inconvenient." She set her knitting aside, her senses straining in the dark. A faint metallic glint caught her eye, the letter opener in Hawthorne's hand, reflecting a sliver of moonlight. "Stay where you are," Hawthorne said, his voice taut. "I'll check the fuse box." His footsteps moved toward the back, but they were uneven, his limp betraying his agitation. Miss Marple sat still, her hands folded, listening as the floorboards creaked. She heard the storage room door open. Then a muffled thud, as if something heavy had shifted. The lights flickered back on, and Hawthorne reappeared, his face flushed, the letter opener still in his hand. "Just a loose wire," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "You should go, Miss Marple. It's late." Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. But before I do, I must ask, did you ever argue with Evelyn about a manuscript, perhaps one tied to Dr. Gray's research? She seemed to think it was important." Hawthorne's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he might lash out. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice a harsh whisper. "She was obsessed with forged manuscripts, some nonsense about a family legacy. I told her it was a myth, but she wouldn't listen. Gray was worse, always fussing over its authenticity. They were both fools." He straightened, his eyes cold. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Miss Marple nodded, her smile unshaken. "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll see myself out." As she stepped into the night, the air was sharp, the village silent save for the distant hoot of an owl. She glanced back at the library, noting a faint light moving in the storage room. Hawthorne, perhaps, checking the hidden room. The letter opener in his hand had been no idle prop, she thought, its sharp edge a silent threat at her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire, Evelyn's diary open before her. She added Hawthorne's words to her notebook, circling forged manuscript and legacy. His admission tied him to Evelyn's investigation, and his limp placed him at the inn, perhaps, as the furtive visitor. The letter opener, too, was a clue. Its blade could have drawn the blood she'd seen on Evelyn's lip. The power cut had been no accident, she suspected, but a moment of panic. A chance for Hawthorne to hide something or to warn her off. She thought of the hidden room, the photograph, the letter to the scribe. Hawthorne, Dr. Gray, and Reverend Clements were entangled in a web of secrets, each guarding a piece of the truth. The manuscript, forged or not, was the key, and Evelyn had died for it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she sipped her tea, her mind weaving the threads of the mystery. Tomorrow she would return to the library, perhaps to search the hidden room again, this time with Inspector Craddock's help. For now the village slept, its secrets locked in the shadows. But Miss Marple was wide awake, her resolve as sharp as the letter opener. She could not forget. Chapter 9. The manuscripts cursed. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a silvery shroud that seemed to whisper of secrets yet untold. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, stood at her garden gate, her thoughts on the library's hidden room and Mr. Hawthorne's veiled threat the night before. The glint of his letter opener, his admission about the forged manuscript, and Evelyn Marsh's diary entries about a stolen legacy had tightened the threads of the mystery. The library was a vault of truths, and Miss Marple was determined to unlock it. She set out with Clara Wren, who had reluctantly agreed to meet her at the library before opening hours, her basket carrying a small trowel ostensibly for gardening, but useful for prying into hidden places. The library was silent as they entered, the air heavy with the scent of old books and lingering tension. Clara's hands shook as she unlocked the side door, her spectacles slipping down her nose. "I don't like this, Miss Marple," she murmured, glancing over her shoulder. "It feels wrong, poking about after everything." Miss Marple's smile was gentle but firm. "Sometimes, Clara, the only way to set things right is to poke a little deeper. Let's find that manuscript Evelyn was so keen on." She led the way to the storage room, her steps steady despite the dim light. The oak bookcase stood as they had left it, its secret door concealed but not forgotten. With a nudge, Miss Marple swung it open, revealing the hidden room once more. Clara hesitated at the threshold, her lantern casting jittery shadows. "What if someone comes?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the creak of the floorboards. "Then we'll explain we're looking for a book," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but her eyes sharp. She moved to the table, where the candelabrum still stood, its wax drippings hardened into pale stalactites. The shelves held more boxes, but one caught her azure leather case, embossed with the lion crest she'd seen in the photograph and on Dr. Gray's letterhead. She opened it carefully, revealing a manuscript bound in cracked vellum, its pages brittle with age. The title page read, "The Chronicle of St. Mary Mead, 1850, but a faint watermark suggested it was a reproduction, not an original. Clara's breath caught. That's one of the restricted ones. Evelyn asked about it, but I told her it was locked away." Her hands twisted together, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple turned the pages, noting handwritten annotations in the margins, dates, names, and cryptic phrases like debt unpaid and title contested. One entry, in a different hand, stood out. "The legacy is cursed. Let it lie." The ink matched the stains she'd seen near Evelyn's body, and the handwriting bore a resemblance to Dr. Gray's hurried script. "This is no ordinary book," Miss Marple murmured, her fingers tracing the words. Evelyn must have believed. It held proof of something, perhaps, a fraud that cost someone dearly. Before Clara could respond, a sharp rap echoed from the library's main door, followed by a voice calling, "Clara, are you in there?" It was Miss Lavender, the village antiquarian, known for her knowledge of old documents and her penchant for gossip. Clara froze, her face pulling, but Miss Marple gestured for her to answer. Miss Lavender bustled in, her grey curls bouncing under a wide-brimmed hat. "I heard you were open early," she said, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Thought I'd check on that old chronicle for my research. The one about the village's founding families." She paused, noticing the open bookcase. "Good heavens, what's this?" Miss Marple seized the opportunity, holding up the manuscript. "Miss Lavender, you're just the person we need. Clara and I found this in the archives. It seems to have interested Evelyn Marsh. Can you tell us anything about it?" Miss Lavender adjusted her pince-nez, peering at the manuscript with a frown. "Oh, that's the Grey family chronicle, or rather, a forgery of it. Caused quite a stir in the 1890s. The original was said to prove the Greys' claim to a vast estate, but it vanished, and this copy turned up years later, full of errors. Dr. Grey's grandfather swore it was genuine, but the margins tell a different story, full of notes disputing its authenticity." She tapped a page. "See here. These annotations suggest someone was hiding a theft-of-land deal gone wrong, I'd wager." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The manuscript's annotations matched Evelyn's diary entries about a stolen legacy, and Dr. Grey's connection was undeniable. "Did Evelyn ever ask you about this?" she said, her voice casual but her gaze steady. Miss Lavender nodded, her lips pursing. "She did, a few weeks back. Wanted to know about the Grey family's history. I told her it was a dangerous subject. People don't like old wounds reopened." She glanced at Clara, who was staring at the floor. "You knew that, didn't you, Clara? You were there when Evelyn came to me." Clara's head snapped up, her cheeks flushing. I didn't think it mattered. She was just curious." Her voice trembled, and she backed toward the door, as if ready to flee before Miss Marple could press further. A folded note slipped under the library's main door, its edges curling in the draft. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Miss Marple moved swiftly, picking it up before Clara could. The paper was heavy, like the letter from the hidden room, and its message was stark. Leave the past buried or join it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but its intent was clear, a warning meant to silence her. Miss Marple tucked the note into her basket, her smile unshaken. "Well, Miss Lavender, you've been most enlightening. Clara, perhaps you'd lock up. After us, I think we've disturbed enough dust for one morning." She led the way out, her mind racing. The manuscript, the note, Clara's fear pointed to a scandal rooted in the Grey family's past. One Evelyn had died trying to uncover. They stepped into the misty village. Miss Lavender chattered about local history, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The manuscript's annotations, the lion crest, Dr. Grey's ink-stained hands, it all wove together, a tapestry of greed and deception. Clara's silence was telling, her knowledge of Evelyn's inquiries a secret she guarded closely, and the note under the door suggested someone was watching, desperate to keep the manuscript's curse-buried at her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the manuscript's title page etched in her mind. She added the note's warning to her notebook, circling grey family and forgery. The threat only sharpened her resolve, confirming that the truth was close. Tomorrow she would consult Inspector Craddock, perhaps to examine the manuscript further. For now she sipped her tea, her mind tracing the contours of a mystery that pulsed with the weight of St. Mary Mead's hidden past. Each clue a step closer to unraveling the curse that had claimed Evelyn's life. Chapter 10. The Nighttime Intruder. The night draped St. Mary Mead in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, the glow of a single candle casting soft shadows across her parlour, the threatening note-leaf, the past buried, or join it lay on her writing desk. Its stark words, a chilling reminder of the danger circling her investigation. The forged manuscript, the lion crest, and Clara Wren's fearful silence had woven a tighter web around Evelyn Marsh's murder, pointing to a scandal that refused to stay buried. Tonight, Miss Marple's thoughts were restless, her mind sifting through the clues, the ledger's cryptic names, the hidden room's secrets, and Mr. Hawthorne's menacing letter opener. She knew the truth was close, but so was the shadow. Watching her as the clock struck 10, a faint creak came from the back garden, sharp and deliberate, like a gate nudged open. Miss Marple's hand paused on her knitting, her senses sharpening. She extinguished the candle, plunging the room into darkness, and moved silently to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The garden was a maze of shadows, the moonlight glinting off the dew-soaked roses. A figure moved near the shed, low and cautious, their outline blurred but purposeful. Miss Marple's heart quickened, not with fear but with the quiet thrill of a puzzle coming into focus. She slipped on her shawl and crept to the back door, her fingers closing around the trowel from her basket, small but sturdy, a gardener's tool that could serve as a weapon if needed. The night air was sharp as she stepped outside, her slippers silent on the damp grass. The figure was gone, but the shed door hung slightly ajar, its hinges gleaming faintly. Miss Marple approached, her breath steady, and peered inside. The shed was undisturbed, save for a single footprint in the soft, earther-polished shoe, its tread matching the ones she'd seen near Evelyn's body in the library. A rustle came from the hedge, and Miss Marple spun, her trowel raised. The garden was empty, but the gate creaked again, swinging shut as if the intruder had fled. She moved swiftly to the gate, her eyes scanning the lane beyond. It was deserted, the village asleep under its blanket of stars. She returned to the shed, noting the footprint's clarity fresh, deliberate, as if the intruder had wanted it seen. A warning, perhaps, like the note under the library door. Back inside, Miss Marple relit the candle and locked the door, her mind racing. The footprint tied the intruder to Evelyn's murder, suggesting the killer was still active, watching her every move. She opened her notebook, adding the incident to her growing list of clues. The polished shoe was a detail she couldn't ignore, too refined for a common prowler, too similar to the boots Evelyn had worn. It pointed to someone with means, someone connected to the library's secrets. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Inspector Craddock at the police station, a small brick building bustling with the quiet efficiency of rural law enforcement. Craddock, a tall man with a tired but keen expression, greeted her with a mix of respect and exasperation. "Miss Marple," he said, offering her a chair, "I should have known you'd be back. What's it this time?" She recounted the nighttime intruder, the footprint, and the threatening note, her voice calm but precise. "I believe they're connected to Evelyn Marsh's murder, Inspector." She was investigating a forged manuscript, and someone is desperate to keep it hidden. Have you learned anything more about her? Craddock leaned back, rubbing his chin. We've confirmed her identity. Evelyn Marsh, private investigator from London, hired by an anonymous client to look into a historical matter in St. Mary Mead. Her notes suggest she was chasing a blackmail ring, something tied to old village families. We found no suspects yet, but that note in her hand, "The truth lies in the margins," is a puzzle. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. A puzzle, indeed. I found a diary at the inn, Inspector, mentioning a keeper and a scribe. I believe they're Reverend Clements and Dr. Gray, perhaps linked to a group meeting in the library's hidden room. And Mr. Hawthorne, did you know he has a limp? Craddock's brow furrowed. A limp? No. But I'll look into it. We've been watching Hawthorne's tempers, no secret, and he was seen arguing with Evelyn the day before she died. He paused, his gaze sharpening. You're not poking into dangerous territory, are you, Miss Marple? That note sounds like a threat. Miss Marple's smile was serene. Oh, I'm only an old woman with a knack for noticing things, Inspector. But I'd suggest checking the library's archives. There's a manuscript there, a forged one, that might hold answers. She rose, adjusting her shawl. And perhaps keep an eye on my cottage tonight, just in case. As she left the station, the village was waking, its streets alive with the chatter of market day. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the ledgers. Entries, the hidden rooms, photograph, and the manuscript's annotations. The intruder's footprint was a bold move, a sign that the killer was growing reckless or desperate. She suspected the blackmail ring Craddock mentioned was tied to the forged manuscript, perhaps a scheme to extort those named in the ledger. Reverend Clements, Dr. Gray, and Hawthorne were all entangled, but the intruder's identity remained. Elusive, at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched as she opened her notebook. She sketched the footprint's tread, noting its similarity to Evelyn's boots. The polished shoe suggested wealth or status, ruling out a common thief. She added blackmail ring to her list, circling keeper and scribe. The intruder had come to warn her, perhaps to steal the diary or the letter from the hidden room, but they had left empty-handed. Their mistake, she thought, was leaving that footprint a clue that brought her closer to the truth. As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind weaving the mystery's threads. Tomorrow she would return to the library, perhaps to examine the manuscript's annotations with Miss Lavender's help. For now she locked her doors, her eyes lingering on the garden gate. The nighttime intruder had failed to silence her, but their presence confirmed one thing. The truth was close, and someone would stop at nothing to keep it buried. Chapter 11. The blackmail web. The late afternoon in St. Mary Mead was cloaked in a gentle haze, the sun dipping low and casting golden streaks across the village's rooftops. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the threatening note from the library, and the memory of the nighttime intruder's footprint vivid in her mind. Evelyn Marsh's diary, the forged manuscript, and the ledger's cryptic entries had woven a complex web, one that entangled Reverend Clements, Dr. Gray, and Mr. Hawthorne in a conspiracy of secrets. Inspector Craddock's revelation about a blackmail ring had sharpened her focus, and today she intended to tug at the threads, starting with the villagers named in the ledger. Her basket, filled with a small tin of biscuits as a pretext, accompanied her as she set out to unravel the blackmail web. Miss Marple's first stop was the vicarage, where Reverend Clements was tending his roses, his thin hands wielding clippers with a nervous precision. He looked up as she approached, his spectacles glinting in the fading light. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained, "what brings you back so soon?" "Oh, just a neighbourly visit," she said, offering the biscuits with a smile. "Been thinking about poor Evelyn Marsh. Inspector Craddock mentioned she was investigating a blackmail ring. Did she ever hint at such things during your literary meetings?" The vicar's clippers paused, a rose petal fluttering to the ground. "Blackmail," he said, his voice high. No, nothing like that. Just books. You know Dickens Brontë." His hands trembled, and he turned back to the roses. Snipping with unnecessary force, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she pulled her knitting from her basket, her eyes never leaving him. "Of course, Reverend, but I found a ledger in the library with names circled yours among them. Keeper, it said. Curious, don't you think?" Clement's face paled, and he dropped the clippers, his fingers fumbling to retrieve them. "A ledger I don't know anything about that, just library records, surely." But his eyes darted to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clements was watching from the window. Her face drawn, Miss Marple nodded, her smile gentle but unyielding. "Perhaps, though I heard you've had some financial troubles, gambling debts, I believe." "It's no shame, Reverend, but it does make one wonder if Evelyn stumbled onto something sensitive." The vicar's shoulders slumped, his voice barely a whisper. "It was years ago, Miss Marple, a foolish lapse, long settled. Evelyn, she asked questions, yes, but I told her nothing." He glanced at the window, lowering his voice further. "Please, don't tell my wife. She doesn't know." Miss Marple patted his arm, her tone soothing. "Mum's the word, Reverend. But do be careful. Secrets have a way of surfacing." She left him among the roses, his face ashen, and made her way to Dr. Gray's cottage, her mind turning over his confession. The ledger's keeper had a motive blackmail could ruin a vicar's reputation. Dr. Gray was in his cluttered parlour, surrounded by manuscripts and ink bottles, when Miss Marple knocked. He greeted her with a forced smile, his white hair dishevelled. "Miss Marple, twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I was passing by," she said, setting the biscuit tin on his desk. "I've been thinking about that manuscript Evelyn was so curious about, the forged one with the Gray family crest. Did she ever suggest it was tied to blackmail, Doctor?" Gray's hand jerked, knocking over an ink bottle, its contents pooling across a page. "Blackmail," he said, mopping it up with a rag. "Ridiculous. She was obsessed with that manuscript, yes, but it's just a historical curiosity. My grandfather's work, nothing more." His eyes flicked to a locked drawer, betraying his nerves. Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her gaze sharp. "A curiosity worth killing for, perhaps. I found a ledger with your name circled, scribe, and Evelyn's diary mentioned your reluctance to discuss the legacy." Dr. Gray's face flushed, his voice rising. "I told her it was nonsense. The manuscripts are fake, yes, but it's no secret. My credentials are sound. Miss Marple, nothing to hide." But his hands shook as he shoved papers into the drawer, locking it with a key he tucked into his waistcoat. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on to Mr. Hawthorne, who was at the Blue Boar Inn, nursing a pint in the corner. His broad frame seemed to fill the tap room, his eyes narrowing as she approached. "Miss Marple," he growled, "you're persistent, I'll give you that. Just a quick word," she said, offering the last of her biscuits. "I heard Evelyn was investigating a blackmail ring. Your name was in a ledger, Mr. Hawthorne, Shadow, I believe. And she wrote about a man with a limp, someone she met here. Hawthorne's pint glass slammed onto the table, ale sloshing over the rim. You're treading on thin ice, old woman. I told you she was a meddler. Yes, I argued with her about her poking into my affairs. An old indiscretion, nothing more. A brief affair, long over. His limp was pronounced as he stood, towering over her. Leave it be, or you'll regret it. Miss Marple held his gaze, her smile unshaken. Thank you for your candour, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll let the inspector know. She left the inn, her heart steady despite his threat. The village was quiet now, but as she passed the library, a grim discovery stopped her cold. A second body, slumped by the side entrance, a torn library card clutched in its hand. It was Mrs. Tuttle, the village gossip, her throat bruised, her eyes wide with shock. Miss Marple knelt, her breath catching. The library card was stamped with the same crest as the vicar's papers, and a faint scent of lavender clung to the body Evelyn sent. She called for the constable, her mind racing. Mrs. Tuttle had been at the vicarage tea, whispering about secrets. Had she known too much? At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. She added the second murder, circling blackmail ring and library card. The ledger's names Reverend Clement's debts, Dr. Gray's falsified credentials. Hawthorne's affair were motives for blackmail, and Mrs. Tuttle's death suggested the killer was tying up loose ends. The manuscripts, annotations, Evelyn's diary, the threatening note all pointed to a legacy worth killing for. Tomorrow she would set a trap, using the manuscript to draw the killer out. For now, she sipped her tea, the villager's silence, heavy with the weight of its secrets, each one a step closer to the truth. Chapter 12. The trap is sprung. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of deepening blues, streaked with clouds that seemed to guard the village's secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat in her parlour, the forged manuscript from the libraries. Hidden room open before her, its annotated margins whispering of a stolen legacy. The second murder, Mrs. Tuttle, the village gossip, found with a torn library card, had tightened the noose around the mystery. The ledger's names, Evelyn Marsh's diary, and the threatening note all pointed to a blackmail ring rooted in the library, with Reverend Clements, Dr. Gray, and Mr. Hawthorne as its key players. Tonight, Miss Marple planned to set a trap, using the manuscript as bait to draw the killer into the open. Her basket, packed with a thermos of tea as a pretext, accompanied her as she headed to the library, where Inspector Craddock had agreed to her plan with a mix of skepticism and trust. The library was dimly lit, its shelves looming like silent sentinels as Miss Marple arranged a small meeting in the reading room. She had sent discreet notes to Reverend Clements, Dr. Gray, and Mr. Hawthorne, claiming she had decoded the manuscript's symbols and wished to discuss its implications for the library's future. Clara Wren, pale and nervous, was tasked with setting out chairs, her hands trembling as she glanced at the cordoned-off historical fiction section. "Miss Marple, are you sure this is wise?" she whispered, her spectacles slipping down her nose. What if they get angry?" Miss Marple's smile was steady, her eyes sharp. "Sometimes, Clara, a little agitation brings the truth to light. Just stay close, and leave the rest to Inspector Craddock." She patted the girl's arm, noting the way Clara's gaze darted to the storage room door, as if expecting a ghost to emerge. The men arrived one by one, each carrying an air of unease. Reverend Clements entered first, his thin frame hunched, his fingers twisting a handkerchief. "Miss Marple, I hope this isn't about unfounded rumors," he said, his voice strained. Dr. Gray followed, his white hair disheveled and ink-stained, hand clutching a notebook. "This better be worth my time," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Mr. Hawthorne was last, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his limp pronounced as he leaned on a cane. "What's this nonsense about the manuscript?" he growled, his eyes narrowing. Miss Marple stood at the head of the table, the manuscript open before her, its lion crest glinting in the lamplight. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "I've been studying this chronicle, and I believe it holds the key to Evelyn Marsh's death and poor Mrs. Tuttle's. Its margins speak of a stolen legacy, a fraud that enriched one family at another's expense. Evelyn was close to exposing. It wasn't she." The room grew still, the air thick with tension. Reverend Clement's handkerchief tore slightly in his grip. Dr. Gray's hand froze on his notebook, and Hawthorne's cane tapped the floor, a sharp, impatient sound. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," Hawthorne said, his voice low and dangerous. "That manuscript's a fake, nothing more." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "A fake, yes, but one. Worth killing for. Evelyn's diary mentioned a keeper, a scribe, and a shadow. I believe you three were part of a group protecting this secret, perhaps blackmailing each other to keep it buried. But Evelyn threatened to expose it, didn't she?" Reverend Clements gasped, his face paling. "I told her nothing. My debts, they're settled. I had no reason to harm her." His voice cracked, and he glanced at the others, as if seeking rescue. Dr. Gray stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. "This is absurd. My grandfather's manuscript was disputed, yes, but I'm no murderer. Evelyn was a nuisance, always, digging. I told her to stop." His voice rose, and he took a step toward the door, his eyes wild. Hawthorne's cane slammed against the table, silencing them. "Enough. You're stirring up trouble, old woman. There's no blackmail, no conspiracy. Evelyn died because she wouldn't leave well enough alone." His limp was pronounced as he moved toward Miss Marple, his hand reaching for the manuscript. Before he could grab it, the storage room door burst open, and Inspector Craddock stepped out, two constables at his side. "That's enough, Mr. Hawthorne," he said, his voice firm. "Dr. Gray, sit down. We've been listening." Dr. Gray froze, his face ashen, and bolted for the side entrance. A constable tackled him, pinning him to the floor. In the scuffle, a small vial rolled from his pocket, its contents glinting in the lamplighter, clear liquid with a faint chemical odor. Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Inspector, that vial tested for poison. I suspect it's what killed Evelyn." Craddock nodded, securing the vial as the constable cuffed Dr. Gray. "We'll have it analyzed," he said, turning to Hawthorne and Clements. "You two, don't move." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but piercing. "Dr. Gray, you were the scribe, weren't you? You forged those annotations to protect your family's claim, but Evelyn found proof of the fraud. You poisoned her, didn't you, to keep her quiet?" Dr. Gray's shoulders slumped, his voice a broken whisper. "She was going to ruin me. My grandfather's legacy. It's all I have. I didn't mean for it to go so far." He sank to his knees, tears streaking his face. Hawthorne snorted, his cane tapping. "Fool, you think you're the only one with secrets." But his eyes betrayed fear. and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow. Reverend Clements clutched his handkerchief, his voice trembling. "I swear I didn't kill her. I only kept quiet. They threatened to expose my debts." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles still in her hands. "Thank you, gentlemen. The trap has sprung, and the truth is clearer now." She turned to Craddock, her smile serene. "Inspector, I believe Dr. Gray is your man for Evelyn's murder, but Mrs. Tuttle's death, that's another matter. The library card in her hand suggests someone else was tying up loose ends." Craddock's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "We'll take it from here, Miss Marple. You've done more than enough." He escorted the men out, Dr. Gray in cuffs, Hawthorne and Clements under close watch. Clara, silent until now, collapsed into a chair, her face pale. "It's over, isn't it?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the manuscript. Miss Marple patted her hand, her gaze steady. "Not quite, dear. There's one more piece to find." She left the library, the night air sharp against her cheeks. Dr. Gray's confession had unravelled part of the web, but Mrs. Tuttle's murder lingered, a shadow cast by another hand. At her cottage, Miss Marple added the vial and Dr. Gray's confession to her notebook, circling Mrs. Tuttle. Tomorrow she would press Clara, whose fear hid more than she admitted. For now, she sipped her tea, the villagers' secrets pulsing in the silence, one step closer to being fully revealed. Chapter 13. The confession. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns across her parlour. The events of the previous night, the trap at the library, Dr. Gray's tearful confession, and the lingering mystery of Mrs. Tuttle's murder had left her restless but resolute. Dr. Gray, the scribe, had admitted to poisoning Evelyn Marsh to protect his family's fraudulent legacy. But the torn library card in Mrs. Tuttle's hand pointed to another killer, one still lurking in St. Mary Mead's shadows. Suspicions had turned to Clara Wren, whose fear and evasions suggested a deeper involvement. Today, she would confront the young librarian, armed with the weight of the ledger, the diary, and the truth. Her basket, filled with a small jar of honey as a pretext, accompanied her as she set out for the police station, where Inspector Craddock was questioning Dr. Gray. The station was a hive of quiet activity, constables murmuring over reports as Craddock greeted Miss Marple with a weary nod. "You've stirred quite a hornet's nest, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Gray's confessed to Evelyn's murder, used a fast-acting poison from his study, slipped into her tea at the library, said she was about to expose his grandfather's forgery, but he swears he didn't touch Mrs. Tuttle. Any thoughts on that?" Miss Marple's smile was serene, her eyes sharp. "I believe him, Inspector. Mrs. Tuttle's death was too theatrical with that library card clutched in her hand. It feels like a message meant to divert us. I'd like to speak with Clara Wren. She's been hiding something, and I suspect it's tied to the ledger's final entry, a name we haven't placed." Craddock raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Clara's at the library, helping with the inventory. I'll send a constable with you. Be careful, she's skittish as a deer." The library was open but subdued, its shelves bathed in the soft glow of morning light. Clara stood behind the counter, sorting books with mechanical precision, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her spectacles fogging slightly as she worked. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her face paling. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't expect you today." Miss Marple set the honey jar on the counter, her smile gentle but unyielding. "Just a small gift, Clara, to brighten your day. You've been under such strain with all that's happened. I thought we might talk about Evelyn and perhaps Mrs. Tuttle." Clara's hands froze, a book slipping to the counter. "Mrs. Tuttle," she whispered. I don't know anything about that." Her eyes darted to the storage room where the hidden door lay concealed. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but piercing. "Clara dear, I found a ledger with names circled keeper, scribe, shadow, and one more, unmarked but recent, written in your hand. Evelyn's diary mentioned a silent partner in the blackmail ring. I believe that was you, wasn't it? You knew what she was uncovering, and when Mrs. Tuttle started talking, you panicked." Clara's spectacles slipped down her nose, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "No, I didn't mean for any of this." She sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "It was my aunt's name in that manuscript. Clara Wren wasn't my real name. I took it to escape my past, a scandal in London. Evelyn found out, said she'd expose me unless I helped her get the manuscript. I didn't kill her, Dr. Gray. Did that but Mrs. Tuttle? She overheard me talking to Evelyn, started spreading rumours. I couldn't let her ruin me." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her gaze steady. "So you strangled her, Clara, and left that library card to point us elsewhere. The lavender scent on her body, you used Evelyn's vial to confuse us, didn't you?" Clara's sob broke the silence, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't want to. I wanted to be free. I thought if I made it look like Evelyn's killer, no one would suspect me." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "Please, Miss Marple, don't tell them. I'll leave. I'll disappear." Miss Marple shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "The truth can't be buried, Clara. You must face it for your own sake." She signaled to the constable waiting outside, who entered quietly, his face sombre. "Inspector Craddock will need to hear this, dear. It's the only way." As the constable led Clara away, her confession hung in the air like a fading echo. Miss Marple stood alone in the library. The manuscripts weighed heavy in her thoughts. Dr. Gray's poison had silenced Evelyn, and Clara's fear had ended Mrs. Tuttle, each act a desperate bid to protect a fragile secret. The ledger, the diary, the hidden room, all had led to this moment. The unraveling of a blackmail web spun from greed and shame at her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her notebook open. She added Clara's confession, circling silent partner. The village was quiet now. The library's secrets laid bare. Dr. Gray and Clara would face justice, and the manuscript would be locked away, its curse lifted. Tomorrow she would visit Craddock to ensure the loose ends were tied. For now she sipped her tea, her mind at peace. The puzzle complete save for one final reflection on the frailty of those who hid from their pasts. Chapter 14. The library restored. The late summer sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, its warmth softening the scars of the past week's turmoil. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue scarf, the rhythm of her hands mirroring the calm that had settled over the village. The library, once a stage for secrets and death, was set to reopen today, its hidden room sealed, its shadows dispersed. Dr. Percival Gray's confession to Evelyn Marsh's murder and Clara Wren's tearful admission to killing Mrs. Tuttle had unraveled the blackmail web, exposing a tangled legacy of greed and fear. The forged manuscript, with its damning annotations, had been donated to a museum in London. Its curse lifted from St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's basket, now empty of clues, rested at her feet, a silent testament to the mystery's resolution. The village had buzzed with shock in the days following the arrests. Dr. Gray, his scholarly facade shattered, faced trial for poisoning Evelyn to protect his family's fraudulent claim to a long-lost estate. Clara, her stolen identity exposed, had confessed to strangling Mrs. Tuttle in a desperate bid to silence the gossip that threatened her new life. Reverend Clements, though not a murderer, had admitted to concealing his gambling debts. His role as the ledger's keeper, a minor thread in the larger scheme. Mr. Hawthorne, the shadow, had escaped charges, but left the village under a cloud of whispers, his affair and temper no longer secret. The ledger, the diary, the threatening note-all had been pieced together by Miss Marple's quiet persistence. Each clue a step toward justice. As she knitted, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the library's reopening. The vicarage had organized a small ceremony, with Mrs. Clements bustling about to ensure the tea was strong and the scones plentiful. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and made her way to the village green, where a crowd had gathered outside the library's freshly polished doors. The oak gleamed, the ivy trimmed, and a new sign promised a place for all to read. The air was alive with chatter, the village eager to reclaim its sanctuary of stories. Inside, the library smelled of wax and fresh paint, the historical fiction section no longer cordoned off, but adorned with a display of Jane Austen's works, a nod to Miss Marple's original quest. Miss Lavender, the antiquarian, stood near the counter, her pince-nez glinting as she regaled a group with tales of the village's less scandalous history. Inspector Craddock was there, too, his tired face softened by a rare smile as he nodded. To Miss Marple, "You've outdone yourself this time," he said, his voice low. "The chief inspector's calling you a marvel, though he'll never admit it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile serene. "Oh, Inspector, I only noticed what was there to see. People's secrets have a way of betraying them, don't they?" She glanced at the counter, where a new librarian, cheerful young woman from a neighbouring village, sorted books with brisk efficiency. Clara's absence was a quiet wound, but the village was healing. Its trust in the library slowly restored. Mrs. Clements approached, her apron dusted with flour, a tray of scones in her hands. "Miss Marple, you must have one," she insisted, her voice warm but tinged with gratitude. "If it weren't for you, we'd still be living in fear. To think it was all about that dreadful manuscript." Miss Marple took a scone, her thoughts on the manuscript's margins, debt unpaid, title contested. "It was never just the manuscript, Mrs. Clements," she said gently. "It was what it stood for, greed, shame, the lengths people go to hide their pasts. Poor Clara, poor Dr. Gray, they thought silence would save them." The ceremony began, the new librarian cutting a ribbon as the crowd clapped. Miss Marple stood at the back, her knitting tucked away, her gaze wandering to the storage room door, now locked and painted over. The hidden room was sealed, its secrets surrendered to the light. She thought of Evelyn Marsh, her lavender scent, and polished boots, a woman who had come to St. Mary Mead seeking truth and found death instead. And Mrs. Tuttle, whose gossip had been her undoing, a victim of a frightened girl's desperation. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple walked home, the village settling into its familiar rhythm. The green was alive with children playing, the blue bore in sin creaking in the breeze. At her cottage, she settled into her armchair, her notebook closed for the first time in weeks. She added no new entries, there were none to add. The ledger's names, the diaries, revelations, the footprint in her gardenal had led to this quiet resolution. Dr. Gray and Clara faced justice, their trials set for the autumn, and the village was free of its shadows. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes on the garden where roses bloomed despite the fading summer. The library was restored, its stories safe once more, but she knew St. Mary Mead would always hold secrets tucked in its corners like forgotten books. For now, though the conundrum was solved, the truth no longer hidden in the margins, she smiled, her needles clicking again, content in the knowledge that peace, however fragile, had returned to her village. The sun set, casting a warm glow over her cottage, and Miss Marple knitted on, the mystery closed, her heart as steady as the rhythm of her hands.